Salles in France. He's currently a researcher at the School of Economics and Management of Lund University in Sweden, and he holds a PhD in economics from the University of Clermont-Auvergne in France and the Stockholm Resilience Center in Sweden. So it would be nice to have this conversation with him about post-growth. I'm just going to make an introduction about why we're talking about post-growth, degrowth related to Impact Hub, and then you can build your presentation or your conversation the way that you want. But cool. Impact Hub is a network of businesses that, in contrast with the regular business market, are looking for solutions to tackle social and environmental challenges. We're thinking of different ways to understand the economy, going from a linear economy to a circular economy that includes more perspectives and that considers intra and intergeneration issues, for example. However, we're still part of the system, and we are a network of businesses. And the system operates and is guided by the perspective of growth. So then we think about including nature's perspective in the growth or development perspective, and we can think of a green growth framework where continued economic expansion is compatible with our planet's ecology, as technology, change, and substitution will allow us to absolutely decouple GDP from resource use and carbon emissions. And then earlier this morning, we had a session about regenerative economy. That was the first session of the day, which was super cool, and regenerative enterprises. And we talked about the necessity of changing the mindset, not just of businesses, but also from investors and regulators on how the conversation is bigger than just talking about sustainability matters. We already reached a point where planetary boundaries were transpassed, and this has been felt all around the globe. And something that is really interesting for me, specifically when analyzing the role of Impact Hub as this player that is connecting the new economies and the innovators, practitioners on the ground, I come with a question, which is how do we move beyond a status quo conversation where we see the environment and social problems, where we see the environmental social problems, but we leave that to the market to regulate what is going to happen with that. And we go for a more reformative and transformative approach to the structures. And what is the actual role of Impact Hub as an actor in this systemic change? So then going to the actual group of questions that I wanted to bring to Timothée, and that's why we brought him for this conversation. I just wanted to explore a little bit more on, in your opinion, is green growth enough to tackle the challenges that we are facing in our planet? Is green growth even possible? And then building on that, is it possible to reduce human ecological footprint while we keep the human welfare index? Is that what the growth is addressing? And is it possible to enjoy both economic growth and environmental sustainability? So the floor is yours. And as I said, again, for everyone, it would be nice if we have more interaction and conversation. So everyone is invited to bring your ideas.
Thank you for the intro, and hello everyone. I'm gonna show you a little something that might simplify what I'm gonna explain. So I'm an ecological macroeconomist, which means I'm looking at countries as economic units, and I'm looking at basically what goes in and what goes out. Usually what goes in is all kind of natural resources, fossil fuel, biomass, materials, metals. Then these, we use them to do stuff within the economy. We use some of the produced stuff to satisfy needs. And then we reject some of the stuff, polluted air, locally, globally, greenhouse gases, e-waste, polluted water, all these kind of stuff. The objective of the game when you're an ecological macroeconomist is that you want your economy to be sustainable. We talk about a biophysical throughput. That's the concept we use. So basically my golden rule, and what I'm trying to do in everything I do as an economist, I'm trying to bring back economies to a situation where their ecological footprint is lower than their biocapacity. So ecological footprint, which is the measure of all the natural resources you use and all the ecosystem services you mobilize. You want this to be lower than your biocapacity, which is the ability of the environment of providing these resources. If you're not, you're in the red. I mean, think of that as your banker. if you earn 2,000 euros a month and you spend 4,000 euros a month, after a couple of months, you're going to receive a difficult call. And the banker is going to tell you, listen, you're nice, but that's not sustainable. Well, that's basically what we've been doing in a country like France, and that's a common situation to all our income countries. In France, since the end of the 1960s, we've been entering an era of ecological deficit. So we've had 50 years of being what we call ecological overshoot. And nature has been calling, and we've been ignoring the calls, just like you would do with your personal banker if you were in financial deficit. So that's what brought me to study degrowth. And now I'm going to talk a bit about this figure. So when you look at a country that is producing and consuming more, because that's what economic growth is. Economic growth is not something very abstract. It's meant to be a measure of production and consumption. So at the end of economic growth, even though it's measured with an abstract indicator, which is GDP, it looks at something tangible, producing and consuming more. And as we do so, and that's something we can see in all countries throughout history, these countries have a tendency to use more energy and materials, okay? Sometimes they can substitute one form of energy for another. You can switch from coal to gas and from gas to renewable energy, and that changes basically your carbon intensity, but you cannot change from like using energy to not using energy. Or otherwise you have to accept the fact that you will have to stop producing and consuming something. And that has brought us into the era of overshoot. That's the growth kind of phase. So far in all countries of the world at all time, there's been not a single case of a country that has managed to produce and consume more while decreasing its total ecological footprint. As I said, you can decrease your greenhouse gas emissions if you substitute fossil energy for low carbon energy, but you cannot, just substitute materials for invisible materials or something. Yeah, there's always the use of a natural resource. The idea of degrowth, and I'll show you a couple of figures to make up that argument a bit more slowly, but here I'm making the broad picture argument, is that we are right now at the moment where we can no longer ignore the calls from nature. So we're like, okay, damn, now we do have to lower ecological footprint. That starts to be in trend in some kind of laws concerning carbon neutrality, for example. I might not be surprised that in the following years, there will be more of these targets concerning the use of resources, the use of water, the use of impact on oceans and biodiversity. Basically, the general tendency right now is like we want to include these biophysical ecological limits into the way the economy functions. My main and first thesis here is to say, well, here you have two choices. Either you can do that, so you can shrink your ecological footprint while producing and consuming more. So that's the idea of green growth, and I'll give you a couple of definitions later. Or if you cannot do this, you have to produce and consume less. There's no third way. It's not like you don't have a billion options. The argument I'm developing is that this kind of reduction of production and consumption, there are many different types of economic contraction. I mean, we've experienced recessions. There are many different types of recessions, and there are many different types of economic contractions that are not looking like recessions. But in any case, I don't think we can do without this temporary phase of economic contraction. And that's the realm of degrowth. That's what I've been studying among a growing number of scientists. We're studying that degrowth scenario, basically, the downscaling of production and consumption. And more precisely, what kind of all ways we could have to shrink an economy. What would be the ways that are more conducive to lowering the ecological footprint? Because A, that's what we're doing it for, but also in doing it in a way that is fair, democratic, and compatible with the maintenance of quality of life. And here I want to make a difference. I felt like the introduction was a bit shy on the use of degrowth. And I find this very often in business crowd, like you guys love the term post-growth. but degrowth is like, just, that runs against a business culture. But the two go together. Like, you cannot have one without the other. Like, imagine right now you have health issues because perhaps you are in a situation of obesity. Post-growth would be the equivalent of like being back in health, and degrowth would be the equivalent of the diet. So facing that, you cannot tell your doctor like, yeah, no, I'm all for like being back in health. And the doctor will be like, yeah, but you have to lose 30 kilos for that. So here, in all overshooting countries, that includes all high income nations and a growing proportions of even like middle income nations, if we want post-growth, meaning this kind of steady state sustainable economy, which I've described as a state of ecological footprint being smaller than biocapacity, being in the green, you have to first do the diet. So the question is, how long is that diet going to last for? And that depends country per country, region per region, what's going to be the respective roles of different actors during that transition. What will be the necessary reforms to basically shield the most vulnerable during that period of transition, to do specific things like financing the welfare state, so completely changing the way we finance the economy so that we can do that difficult ecological transition without jeopardizing quality of life. And then once you've done that, then you can talk about post-growth, which is a more longer-term state of economic development where an economy, let's say, has developed the productive capacity necessary to satisfy everyone's needs. So you have the roads, you have the doctors, you have basic businesses, you have the legal infrastructure, you have all of that. But you're still subject to some biophysical limits. You cannot just get back to some exponential growth, otherwise you will get back into the red. So you need to always balance the needs of your population, which might be changing over time, and the biocapacity of your ecosystem, which might also be changing over time, squared with, of course, technological, social technical progress that might allow you to be more efficient in the use of resources, and unforeseen ecological collapse, which might force you to be less efficient in the use of your natural resources. So that's the broader picture. Now I'm going to show you a couple of things, but since we're not that many, then I'm leaving a lot of time for the questions. Planetary boundaries are overshoot. That means that situation I've detailed for a single country where footprint is higher than biocapacity, we've already reached it for the globe. So that's the first problem. It's a problem because in the world, there's a large part of humanity that has not yet had access to basic means of living a decent life. So we've already overshoot our planetary boundaries even before having given to everyone on Earth just the basic necessities for life. So we have to think in terms of eradicating poverty while decreasing the total amount of resources at the level of the globe. How are we going to do this? Well, it's simple. Like, think of the carbon budget. We have a carbon budget that is limited at the level of the globe. So 1 ton of carbon we're going to emit in Norway is 1 ton of carbon that we won't be able to emit in Nigeria. So 1 ton of carbon we emit today in an SUV in Paris is 1 ton of carbon we won't be able to emit 10 years ago, 10 years into the future, to build a dam against flooding in Bangladesh. So that's the choice we have. It's a choice of how do we split that carbon budget today. And the degrowth options is, let's say, a realistic of that challenge, arguing that the faster we reduce resource use in already rich countries, the one we can afford the shrink, the more we free resources for the further needs of development and adaptation to ecological catastrophes in the future. So it's a bit of a new sharing of a limited ecological budget strategy, you could say. So now I've showed you like this balance of biocapacity and ecological footprint. There are many online platforms, including the Global Footprint Network, where you can go for your country and your region. What's the balance and how it's been changing over time. I think I've put you the one in France here so you can see. So we've been having this deficit for quite a long time. And in contrary to what you would hear by pro-technologist kind of green growthy kind of vibe, this problem has not been solved. It's not because renewable energies are getting cheaper that like somehow the economy is getting sustainable. There's a bit of a carbon obsession within these debates where as soon as you see like greenhouse gases going down, like, yeah, it's cool. Like everybody believes that somehow sustainability is secured. Not at all. Again, like planetary boundaries, many of them, climate change is only one. And so sustainability rather looks like a Rubik's Cube, where climate change is just one color. You need to solve that color while solving all the other colors. And also we have varying degrees of overshoot depending on countries. So at the top, you can see high-income countries, very large overshoot. That's the obese countries I've talked about. They're the one that will have to do the macroeconomic diet. In the bottom, you have countries that have not overshoot planetary boundaries and that should be expected to, let's say, have access to more natural resources, because you can see there's a lot of red in the inner circle. That's the donut of Kate Raworth you may have heard of before. So the inner circle represents social needs. So in France or in the US or Australia, like basically there is no social needs in the sense of like poverty, lack of housing, hunger, all of these issues that still exist in the global north, they only exist because of a failure of allocation. There is no homeless people in France because we don't have enough houses. It's just, we prevent them from accessing existing houses. So it's economically, it's a problem that doesn't require extra production. You go to Madagascar, that's a different story. You can still allocate perfectly everything that is there. There will still be people that won't have enough. And so that tells you that somehow need satisfaction, getting to decent levels of well-being will require some kind of productive activities and therefore access to natural resources. I've put you some numbers about inequality. I was talking about this sharing of the carbon budget. We're already doing it. We're already sharing the carbon budget we have, which is limited. So far, we're giving half of it to the top 10% richest people in the world. So they're using 48%. These people, they own 70% of global wealth. So these purchasing power give them access to whatever natural resources they need. On the other hand, and these people, they're very shielded from the cost of climate change. They will only bear 3% of the cost of climate change. Opposite situation for the 4 billion people most in need of development in the world. These people, they emit barely nothing. They own even less. I think there's a mic open. Yeah, okay, thank you. And they will bear up to 75% of the cost of climate change. So every time you hear about sustainability, it's always a subtle balance between different countries in different situations. That has always been my criticism of the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and especially SDG 8, which is kind of like an overall framework that kind of assumes that everyone needs to grow. No, not everyone needs to grow. Growth is a temporary phenomenon where you go from unsatisfied needs to having enough stuff to live a decent life. So by definition, growth is something you go from A to B and it's done and you're happy. Once you have a house and a job and everything, it doesn't make much chance to defend kind of we should keep growing, especially that growth is requiring a lot of natural resources and therefore depriving others in the world of the capacity of growing. Now, I know you've been hearing a lot about green growth, decoupling, these kind of stuff. It's a discourse that is quite vibrant in international organization, the World Bank, the European Commission. You find also in some very pro-tech business circles, but scientifically, it's a concept that is not much present these days. So the concept of green growth in the empirical literature, we rather talk about decoupling, and decoupling is really these empirical study where we look at basically the relation between GDP and various types of environmental pressures. One key message I want to give you now is every single time you hear someone talking about green growth, I want you to ask, okay, what kind of growth, where, and how much, what kind of graining are we talking about, and what is the size of that graining? Because very often, in like 99% of the case, when you hear someone say like, oh, don't worry, UK doesn't need to degrow because we've decarbonized our economy, so we're good. Then these people, they are picking one indicator, here namely greenhouse gases emissions. Very often they use territorial indicators, so they only include what's happening on the continent. So let's say within UK, but they don't take into account imported emissions, which is a bit handy when you're a country that is importing most of what you're using. In France, for example, imported emissions, they represent 51% of our total ecological carbon footprint. So when we say, oh, in France, we want to cut our emission by this and that, we mean we want to cut half of our emission by this and that. And so here, we need to be aware of that difference between relative and absolute decoupling. So relative decoupling means that basically the carbon, let's say, intensity of your economy decreases. So you're relatively more efficient. And that's good because perhaps you're using better technology, perhaps you've just exported of the most polluting industries, but that means per unit of GDP, the amount of carbon goes down. That doesn't mean that your emissions go down. It means per unit of GDP. This is why economists, they love this indicator, and climate scientists, they hate it, because you can have like a decrease of carbon intensity of GDP while having an increase of emissions, which you're like, okay, what we want is basically what we call absolute decoupling, which means an absolute decrease of emissions, which must not only be absolute but also be sufficiently fast. So like a diet, if you need to lose 30 kilos over like before dying, let's say over 2 to 3 years, and you've lost like 10 grams after 2 years, like that's absolute decoupling. Good job. But your doctor is not going to tell you, okay, good, that's a success. No, that's a failure. So UK, for example, just like France and the others 9 countries, the only 11 countries in the world that have experienced absolute decoupling of GDP and greenhouse gas emissions, they've reduced their emissions so smallly that they are in that situation where basically they get a gold star for effort, but in terms of efficacy, we're near nowhere. It's actually that curve. It's a study that just came out. So I told you, you can see on the right, the 11 countries that have experienced some kind of absolute decoupling between GDP and consumption-based carbon emissions. Consumption-based means you include imported emissions. What they've done in the gray curve is tiny reductions. If you project them over the very long term, you get the red curves. Each curve is a country, and the larger one is the average of all the countries. Basically, that tells us that at a current rate of decrease, which we've been observing since 2013, it would take 220 years for them to reach carbon neutrality. So that's like you doing a diet and taking a few centuries to get there. So we understand, even the most basic understanding of climate science tells us that, carbon neutrality has a deadline. Basically, we're trying to reach it before we actually warm the climate to a degree where we unleash a lot of negative consequences. So what we need is the blue curve. That's the one that is compatible with a 1.5 degree fair share pathway. And to get there, to go from red to blue, or rather to expect to go from red to blue by just, saying it's just going to happen naturally, don't worry, everything is fine, technology will save us, that's where I'm starting to be a bit skeptical. That we're talking like taking the best countries in the world that have managed to decarbonize the fastest and assuming that starting right now, as I speak, will multiply the speed of this decarbonation by a factor of 10, and that all countries in the world will also manage to do that, which is the same as assuming that starting tomorrow, everyone will run like 10 times as fast as Usain Bolt. Is it theoretically impossible? Well, I mean, I don't know. Maybe people could do that. If I were to bet my life on it, though, I'd say they won't. But here we're a bit in a similar situation. So that's the kind of data that I'm dealing with every day. We've got more and more of them, just basically showing us that decoupling has not been happening for certain things. The use of materials is nowhere to be seen. So we're actually recoupling. So material intensity of GDP is increasing, which is a problem. And some of the stuff we've been decoupling, like greenhouse gases in these 11 lucky countries, is just so small that actually cannot really, it cannot be declared to be some kind of sustainability victory. So for me, these kind of evidence is enough to say that we will have, in starting as early as possible, to organize a planned downscaling of production and consumption in order to get to the blue curve for greenhouse gases and the many other curves that we've not reached for other environmental pressures. Unless magic. That's the thing. And I'm always very open to this. I'm like, if you can show we can do otherwise, please do. And it is my job every day to actually scroll every single piece of scientific literature to find such proof. Been doing so since 2018, and I haven't found it, but you never know. So we're back to that figure where I've been trying to argue that it's not that much of a choice we have. If we believe in what we're seeing concerning the link between growth and the use of natural resources, we have two choices. First choice is to say, well, I don't care, I keep growing. That choice will result in some kind of collapse later. First, the collapse of livelihood for people in the global south will just miss out on their window for development because either of resource scarcity or just of ecosystem collapse, starting with global warming, and then eventually even collapse in the global north, because after that kind of scarcity and collapse will just go up the power scale, you know, it will start hitting even the richest of us. And so we will end up in some kind of chaotic collapse where economies will have to readapt to a finite planet in chaos and very rapidly, most likely in violence. Or we can, let's say, like, we don't want to go there. So what about precaution principle? What about we be prudent? And right now we actually start downscaling the size of our economy so we can, you know, make them sustainable, get back into the green. Both to make us more resilient to that situation where, because of water scarcity, because of a massive flood, because of a pandemic, you know, our economy come to a halt, and also out of sympathy for other countries, which we know their ecological transition would be much more difficult than ours. So now I want to finish with the last argument, because often people say like, wow, okay, I understand the biophysical challenge of that, but that's going to be tough because we have to sacrifice economic growth. And, you know, it's just such a sacrifice. I don't think it is such a sacrifice. I don't know why people love economic growth so much. It is a strange thing. You know, economic growth is a macroeconomic phenomenon. So first, I mean, we can talk plenty about like what indicator we use. I think it's a bit of a silly indicator. It doesn't really measure the thing we should be measuring. But in any case, even if that was like a good indicator of, let's say, I mean, it's an indicator of income, right? Of total income. But when you look at who's benefiting from this income, here we're going to phase out Australia because that's just way too easy to criticize. Let's look at EU on the right, where basically between 2010, 2019, the top 10% of the population received 54% of the gains of economic growth. So you have a decade of growth of national income, and 54% of that goes to the 10% richest. Now we know from social sciences that when inequality goes wider, usually it just lower general well-being. And so now we have a decade of growth, or at least half of a decade of growth, let's say, to just count this 54%, that has just gone straight to increase inequality, while of course making the ecological footprint larger. And so when you see this, you're like, I mean, if we could come back 10 years ago, could we not say we're, let's say, just taking that part of increase of national income that end up in the pocket of the people who needs it? Let's say here we assume that the bottom 90% needs it. I would go even lower and say that maybe only the bottom 50% needs it. And when you look at this, you realize that they only receive like a few percent often of like national income growth. And then you can say all the rest is the kind of needs we can simplify, is the kind of production and consumption we can afford not to have, so that actually that makes it easier for us to lower our ecological footprint. So here I think there's even a window where you can imagine an economic contraction based on a massive redistribution of not only wealth, but also of the income of that wealth, that we see both a decrease of total ecological footprint without seeing a massive loss in quality of life, but even actually an increase in general well-being, because we see also a decrease in inequality. That's also, and I will finish with these slides showing that it's not even a given, like the link between GDP per capita and well-being is not that direct. I mean, that graph, it's a few years old, but the ranking from the World Happiness Report, which they do every year, where you can see that Costa Rica is like place 16, is just beating France with like 1/3 of its GDP per capita. So we understand this. Past a certain GDP per capita, once you're out of the ditch, like development-wise, well-being is not determined by a level of income. Well-being is determined by the quality of your health and education infrastructure, by equality, which is basically access to these infrastructures. If US style, you have super good healthcare system, but you don't let the huge part of your population access it, then obviously your life expectancy and overall level of healthcare is going to suck. That's why, the health, the let's say the economically, the GDP proportion of health activities in the US is so big compared to the one in Europe, but healthcare standards are so much higher in Europe than in the US, which shows us basically that it's not like money and kind of production measure of these stuff that really matter. After some point, is just a matter of allocation. So I'll finish with that graph, and then that'll be my 30 minutes, and we can use the rest for discussion to show you my favorite study. The reference is on the right. 140 countries, which authors have compared based on two things: 11 indicators of social development, social prosperity, you call it whatever you want. That's the vertical axis, that's the inside of the donut. And indicators, 7 indicators of ecological overshoot, that's the horizontal axis. And basically, they've looked at trajectories of development from the 90s to 2015. That's why you see the little tails attached to each circle, which is an individual country. And basically what we want is a development trajectory that is vertical. You want to increase your living standards while maintaining or even decreasing your ecological overshoot. In the purple countries, which are income countries, we realize like we're stagnating. We're just increasing our footprint, but we're not increasing our living standards. And so, and when you compare Canada, Australia, and the United States, so ecologically obese countries that manage to reach the same living standards or even lower living standards that, I don't know, Norway, Sweden, or South Korea, you can open the possibility of actually, wow, a certain downscaling of production and consumption in the US could be compatible with maintaining quality of life. I mean, for example, the Portuguese, they live 2 years longer than the average American life expectancy, even though they have I think 65% less GDP per capita. So here we see in this graph that trajectories of development, they are much more complex than we think. And what I love most about this study is that it's completely ditching GDP, which I think we should do. The goal here is to decouple well-being, need satisfaction, vertical axis, from ecological footprint. That's true economic development. It's managing to get more well-being out of a same or smaller quantity of natural resources. Economic growth, inflation, purchasing power, all that kind of stuff. It's really administrative objectives. It's just, it matters at some point in the way you organize the fabrication of these natural resources, but it should not be a meta objective. Okay, I stop here and let's go for questions.
Nice. So that's when you guys ask questions. Mari, you have a question. Do you want to share your question?
Sure. Hi, Timothée. Thank you so much for your session. Very enlightening, really, really good. Okay, so we do require redistribution of income. We do require taking it seriously from the government point of view, how we're working with policy then to, make sense that billionaires have no place in this earth if we really want to keep humanity alive in the long run. So how do you see these debates happening in the policy level? And yeah, how also do you see representatives of the top 10%, not only governments, but businesses taking these conversations forward? Are you part of these dialogues?
Well, I mean, so far it's not doing so good. We must face to that fact. As it's very easy macroeconomically to say that shift, the distribution of income and wealth, and then you will have, a lower ecological footprint, which is scientifically true. Now that works on paper, but you're entirely right. Like if someone has a strategy on how actually doing that, I mean, what we can start looking at is just different countries that are acting differently in terms of pre-distribution, distribution, and redistribution of wealth and income. I mean, starting, for example, with the US and France, or, and then we see also there's a varying degree of, let's say, collective effort being invested in smoothing out the distribution of wealth. So I think there's no, like, we're not locked in a situation where somehow we have a monarchic control of the economy by the wealthy, and whatever we try will be opposed by powerful lobbies. I mean, we do have political organization, United Nations, the European Parliament, individual national parliaments, all kind of think tanks and universities and business organizations that are just acting a bit against that stream. And I feel like certain of these discourses have shifted very fast during the pandemic. So certain solutions that, I mean, the pandemic is a perfect example of like a super huge problem hitting us in the face, and hitting like a very expensive problem, and that will like hitting the most vulnerable that basically don't have the purchasing power at this point in time to pay for it. And so it's bringing these questions like, how do we basically pay for that? Climate change is very much the same. We've seen that it's a very expensive problem that is just hitting the poorest first. Unfortunately, the one that if they had the money to pay to avoid it, they would have paid. I mean, if you're living on an island, the island is going to disappear, and you could pay €1 billion to just stop climate change, and you have €1 billion, you would spend it. But they don't. So they don't have this kind of, they cannot cast this ballot. But discourses are increasing. Then I think, from my perspective, like we are already just having to tackle that problem for other reasons. Like, for example, many economists have been working showing that high levels of wealth inequality is detrimental to democracy. And so if we believe in the idea of a more participatory democracy, a better functioning democracy, then even that alone is a good justification. So perhaps through the aggregation of reasons to reduce inequality, from addressing ecological crisis to improving democracy, of improving well-being and all of that, we will reach a point where it will become very, very, very difficult to argue against. And then last point, because before there were a lot of intellectuals that had built like very fancy pseudo-scientific theories to explain to you that wealth trickled down and all that kind of stuff. But now I think these have been debunked so hard by a new community, like a new international community of researchers that are just not falling into that trap. So it becomes more and more difficult, I say, to smoke away the public by showing them fancy numbers, telling them, look, we make the rich richer, and don't worry, they will solve climate change through innovation, and they will give their money to the poor through philanthropy. Then you can easily mobilize studies, be like, well, that's a lie. So that's fine. I understand you're defending your interest, but scientifically that has proven to be wrong. Before, perhaps it was more difficult to mobilize these arguments.
Nice.
Thank you.
If anyone else has a question, I do have a question. So if anyone else wants to jump in, but I can start by saying degrowth is to be based in democratic decision making. And then when we talk about that, I would like to understand from you, like, what's your perspective on what are the roles that businesses, when we're talking here about businesses, and as you said, like when we are businesses, it's hard for us to talk about like degrowth and not just go like directly to post growth. But then what is the role that you see from small businesses to big businesses on actually making this conversation happen when we're talking about degrowth? That's question number one. And then just a second question. when we're talking about SDGs, for example, this is something that many people have many concerns about, that if this is actually, when we're talking about like sustainable development, if this is actually tackling the problems that we're facing, especially the way that the SDGs, they are constructed. But they are kind of like this way because they are based in the economic market that we have nowadays, in the way that the structure is made. So how do you also see like degrowth actually being the opposite from that, and actually saying like, okay, we have kind of like a different way of doing things?
I will start from the second one, just showing like I think the addition of what we're learning from degrowth is just that if you want to achieve the SDGs, especially the 4 SDGs that have to do with biophysical health, then you have to somehow sacrifice on certain of the financial monetary SDGs. So it's pointing to a contradiction at the heart of the SDG agenda to be like, okay, so far, how is it so that the biophysical SDGs are degrading while, some of the economic one are improving? And, will we be able to improve both at the same time? The growth skeptical literature has answered no. So far, we need to adapt the SDG as to open for the possibility to have degrowth, organized degrowth in the global north, in order basically to sustain sustainable growth in the global south and to achieve all of the SDGs that are there concerning, hunger, education, justice, and all of that. Doesn't need to change. It's not a reinventing of the wheel. It's just, let's say, a different strategy, a more precise strategy to get there. First question, I'm going to be quite radical. I don't believe that businesses have any role to play in the transition. And I say this to be provocative, because I think to think about that, all of you here needs to think outside of your business. So we cannot think of the transition from the perspective of a business as an entity. First, because the business is not a political entity. A country is, the EU is, you are as a citizen or as a member of a municipality. A business is an ephemeral thing that you can create. It's like a Facebook group. You create it, you dissolve it, anything goes. It doesn't have a right to vote. It doesn't have a seat to the table. Business should never be sitting at a table. They're only sitting here because they just have enormous financial power, and so we're nice to them so that they come. But who should be sitting at the table are you, regardless whether you're a worker at this business or an owner or an investor or a customer. It doesn't matter. You're an actor, let's say, of a specific sector concerning mobility or food or clothing. You have a say in deciding that kind of stuff. And the say of the CEO of a famous branding company should not be higher than the say of, a customer of that thing. So I feel like we should downgrade businesses in order to have this democratic discussions that can be had outdoor of financial interest. That the big limitation also, like the very reason why high-income countries have not started that ecological transition. It's not a matter of getting faster. They have not started because it's not lucrative to do so. But a country doesn't have to make a profit. An individual doesn't have to make a profit. A city doesn't have to make a profit. Guess who's the only actor in the economy who needs to make a profit to survive? The for-profit individual firm. And so having organized the economy with this kind of competition in between for-profit individual firms, we have locked ourselves within a growth imperative. Whereas we could organize ourselves differently to do away with that growth imperative. But for that, we need to have a very hard question about the role that the profit motive plays in how businesses think and act.
Nice. Thanks. Before going to Benjamin, we just have a question here, which is a little provocative, which is nice. So the problem is capitalism, or what would you say is the problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we need to define capitalism well. Capitalism is just not a bad word. It's just a very descriptive word to look at an economic system where production and consumption is organized with, I like to name at least 4 institutions. The first one is the for-profit company. So if you take that away, I mean, it's not really capitalism if you don't have any for-profit entity that motivates production. Then you need to have a degree of concentration of the ownership of the means of production. So that's another defining features. Then you need to have a large part of the population that is willing and somehow forced to sell their labor force. Otherwise, also, you cannot really have a well-functioning capitalist economy thing or no, it's just a necessary institution. If all of a sudden, and that's what I've defended in my thesis, the political economy of degrowth, you want to build an economy where every business is a not-for-profit cooperative, where basically you decommodify many goods and services. So with schemes like universal basic services and social security of all kind, local currency, job guarantee and stuff like this, you have an organized access to certain goods and services, social housing that doesn't require, purchasing power on a competitive market. You lose another leg of capitalism. Let's say instead of having a labor market for everyone, part of the population is employed within, the public sector. Another big part is employed within guaranteed, a job guarantee within, let's say, the non-monetary social ecological sector, and only a minority of the population is just acting on actual labor market. You lose another leg of capitalism. And then at the end, what you end up with is an economy that, I call it post-capitalist without having to find a name. It just doesn't fit to that. What we're being sure of is that capitalism as a game, because every economic system is a game, so a software we're applying in the way we behave in the economy, is the objective of this game is to accumulate capital. That's in the name. Right now, we don't want to accumulate capital. What we want is basically we want to lower ecological footprint. So we need, lower ecological footprintism. That's the kind of economic system we need right now. And it doesn't mean that, an economic system is always fit for purpose. It doesn't mean we need to choose one for the next few hundred years. It means that during that ecological transition, we may have to pause, change, downgrade certain rules and institutions that have been in place for a very long time during a context where we were trying to maximize economic growth without much care for ecological footprint.
Super, super good. Thanks. And now just like 5 minutes to the end, Benjamin, a 5 minutes question for a 5 minute sentence.
First of all, thanks for the talk. So I think I lost the idea when I put the hand on because you triggered so many things. So the one thing what I really think is that the democratic system is no, wait, I need to collect my ideas. So back to the marketing. So I think the capitalism that depends on the behavior of the people. So if the people reduce their consumption, what they buy, and really think what they consume, so you can control the industry as well. So if the people say, okay, I don't need a bigger car, I don't need SUV or whatever, so the companies need to rethink about the product and the production line. So you can control, or the people can control what's going on. They could, if they want. But I think nowadays they don't. And that is exactly the same similar situation what you have in the democratic system. So the politician always focus on the next vote, what's going on the next time, and they don't put too much pressure to the people because they want to be revoted. And I think that's a difficult point. So, but that's exactly the same. So as a user, you can think about the product you can consume, and you can think about the politician you vote for. And then it's always the thing whether you only look the short term or you look the long term. And usually no one has a reason to think further than 100 years. So you should do that, but I think that's a difficult point. And beside, of course, you have the information problem and the fake news problem. So, but that's exactly the same. You have to think what you consume, which information, which channel, what you're looking for, how you get your informations. And if you keep that all together on a healthy way, it can be stable or not. but I think that's there are a lot of risks inside because
I don't think it works. Like basically, capitalism as a system without economic growth collapses. It's a growth-based, growth-demanding system. And so if we demonstrate somehow that we cannot green growth, and so therefore we will have to go either with, stagnant economies or with a certain temporary degrowth, if we remain within the capitalist frame, then we're signing ourselves for a specific crisis. And then on this kind of consumer sovereignty, I mean, that's a larger question, but like the SUV is the perfect example. I don't think anyone in any city of the world would have come naturally with the need being like, I need an SUV right now. The SUV, that product, and the fact that now most cars being sold in cities are SUVs, is the very product of an industrial strategy. Was actually in France, SUVs is the highest expenditure category for advertising. So the need for SUVs in the city has been built from a supply side, not based on a need, based on one thing only. SUVs today is in the car market. There's the highest source of profits for car manufacturers.
Sure.
And so they're focused on that.
Of course, but at the end, it's a decision of the consumer whether they buy or not.
I mean, not really. It's just,
of course,
it's more complicated than that. Like,
but it's okay. Of course, it's more complicated, but it's not. It's much more complicated by just saying they produce, so everyone buy.
No, I think the question here of political economy is always to weigh like the power of production on the production side and the power of consumption, which is always different from different goods and services and from different situation. If you're facing like, you want to, let's say, buy something and you only have one company selling it, then the consumer has very little choice. Same thing if you live in a place where there's only one supermarket, you're very dependent to what that supermarket is offering you compared to a situation where you have access to a diversity of supermarkets. So I think what's important here to pay attention for us is the very specific power dynamics that there is in a specific country, in a specific sector, in a specific goods and services. What I've seen for the car market, that's definitely a supply-driven segment for the SUVs. And I think like most fossil fuel, like most nature-intensive products, they are often sold by companies in a high state of power. All fossil fuels extraction companies that are not only private, most of them are just public, but they are concentrated. So in somehow you have billions of isolated consumers that are making decisions about whether or not to take their car today. And then you have also a few hundreds, let's say, companies that make other decisions having to do with opening an oil field or not. And so what we have to look at is, which of the decisions is the best leverage point to accelerate what we want to do, which is basically to lower the use of fossil fuel. Sometime in some market, we find that like supply decision, they can have a faster impact. And sometime in other markets, we find that like demand, and actually my favorite thing, and I think that's what we can take from the last IPCC report, is that acting on both sides, like scissoring demand and supply, is just the best because you're just acting both. So the kind of voluntary simplicity you're describing of trying to invest in public infrastructure so that people don't have to take their car, it creates a possibility. That's good. And then let's say also forcing car companies to stop advertising for their most polluting cars and let's say investing more in creating smaller electric vehicles so that consumers have more options. Then you scissor that kind of mobility decisions from both sides and you give yourself more options. So I think I feel it's 29, so maybe that was a nice concluding consensual remark for all of you guys. Thank you so much for listening to me, and thank you all of you for your questions.
Thank you for accepting doing this conversation with us. I think it was super useful, and it's super triggery for the whole network to actually talk about this. So I just want to express my gratitude, and it was a really good conversation. We have another session starting in a minute, which is the Innovation Awards. So everyone who wants to participate, that's the next session. Thanks, Timothée.
Bye, guys.
Bye.